Lewis Hamilton is back at Mercedes. Do you want to know the reason for his return? Do you want to find out what his salary will be? Do you want to know why Frédéric Vasseur and Charles Leclerc were furious when they heard the news? Stay until the very end. This video is for you. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The moment the announcement hit the airwaves, it was as if a bolt of lightning had ripped through the heart of Formula One, shattering the calm and igniting a firestorm that consumed every corner of the sport's global stage. Within seconds, timelines were flooded with disbelief, hot takes, and feverish speculation. The news was not merely a transfer update, it was a resurrection of a legendary alliance, a reunion between driver and team that had together redefined dominance in the modern era. Lewis Hamilton, the seven-time world champion whose tenure at Ferrari had become an exercise in frustration and strained diplomacy, was returning to Mercedes. It was an act that blended shock value, narrative poetry, and ruthless competitive logic all in one breathtaking stroke. Even the most battle-hardened insiders, those who claimed to have seen every twist the sport could produce, were blindsided, caught between awe and curiosity about the forces that had made this seismic reversal possible. In truth, the roots of this decision had been winding their way beneath the surface for months, almost imperceptibly at first. The early days of Hamilton's Ferrari chapter were buoyed by public optimism, both parties framing the move as a marriage of ambition and prestige. Yet beneath the ceremonial smiles and the red carpet press events, cracks had begun to form. Whispers inside the paddock hinted at an undercurrent of dissatisfaction, a friction between Hamilton's approach and the inner culture of Maranello. Sources close to the driver described a growing sense of suffocation, a realization that the expectations placed upon him were not simply high, but inflexible and unforgiving. What had been billed as a partnership of equals was slowly morphing into a system of relentless measurement against Charles Leclerc, a driver deeply embedded in Ferrari's DNA, who understood every quirk of the SF25's delicate handling and aerodynamic mood swings. The turning point came during a turbulent stretch of the season when podiums for Leclerc seemed routine, while Hamilton's race days were defined by desperate battles in the midfield, wrestling with a machine that never felt like his own. Behind closed doors, Frédéric Vasseur's patience began to fray. Publicly, he maintained a composed, corporate tone, praising Hamilton's professionalism. Privately, however, those words were paired with sharper, more pointed reminders of what Ferrari demanded. After the Spanish Grand Prix, a race in which Hamilton had endured tire degradation issues and an ill-timed pit strategy that erased any chance of climbing into the top five, he was summoned into a meeting that would leave a lasting mark. The setting was the team's motorhome, the mood tense enough to make junior staff avert their eyes as the two men sat across from one another. Vasseur, according to multiple insiders, leaned slightly forward, his voice controlled but cold, and delivered a line that would replay in Hamilton's thoughts long after he left the room. "It cannot be that Charles is on the podium and you are outside the points." The words were precise, deliberate, and heavy with implication. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. From that day onward, something inside Hamilton began to shift. Outwardly, he retained the composure of a seasoned professional, continuing to fulfill media obligations with carefully measured answers. Yet those closest to him, engineers, trainers, confidants, began to notice a subtle recalibration in his demeanor. He became more guarded in technical briefings, focusing narrowly on his own corner of the garage and disengaging from broader team discussions. In moments away from the public eye, during long debrief nights or quiet hotel evenings, the conversation would turn to an unmistakable theme, the sense that Ferrari was not prepared to invest the same faith in him that he had committed to them. The growing suspicion that his role within the team was less a shared leadership position and more a secondary seat next to their golden child began to harden into certainty. Meanwhile, in Brackley, the seeds of a reunion were quietly taking root. Mercedes, though locked in their own battle to claw back supremacy from Red Bull, had never fully closed the door on Hamilton, even after his departure. Toto Wolff, long known for his combination of pragmatism and emotional intelligence, kept the lines of communication open. Initial contact was light, almost casual, brief exchanges when paths crossed at circuits, small acknowledgments of mutual respect. But as the season wore on and Hamilton's discontent became more apparent to those who knew where to look, the conversations began to deepen. What started as friendly check-ins evolved into substantive discussions about vision, resources, and the future. The more Hamilton considered the possibility, the clearer it became that the familiarity, trust, and structural excellence of Mercedes offered something Ferrari could not: a return to an environment where his voice carried full weight and his input was treated as a weapon, not a variable to be managed. By the time negotiations began in earnest, the operation was cloaked in absolute secrecy. Meetings were staged in locations far from the race weekend chaos. Private suites in quiet hotels, secure video calls under encrypted channels, and confidential dinners where only a handful of trusted individuals were present. Both sides knew that the leak of even a hint could send the media into a frenzy and destabilize Hamilton's already delicate position in Maranello. The discussions covered everything from technical integration to the political dynamics of his return, with both parties aware that reviving such a partnership would not just be a matter of nostalgia, but a calculated step into a high-pressure new chapter. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. When the deal was finalized and the announcement prepared, the reveal was timed with surgical precision. The moment it hit the public sphere, the reaction was instantaneous and global. Ferrari loyalists reacted with outrage, framing Hamilton's exit as a betrayal. Mercedes supporters, on the other hand, hailed it as the return of a king. Analysts scrambled to dissect the implications, questioning what this would mean for the driver pairing at Mercedes, for Ferrari's recruitment strategy, and for the balance of power in the championship battle. The sheer weight of the news rippled through every aspect of the sport, from sponsorship campaigns to long-term technical planning. For Hamilton, the decision was as much about reclaiming control of his destiny as it was about performance potential. Mercedes represented stability, familiarity, and a culture that had once elevated him to unprecedented heights. But it also represented unfinished business, the chance to write a final chapter on his own terms, to take the fight back to Red Bull in a car and a team he knew could deliver under the most intense pressure. He understood that this return would come with immense scrutiny, that every result would be measured against the dominance of their past era, and that any misstep would be amplified. Yet it was a challenge he welcomed. Those who know him best say Hamilton thrives not in comfort, but in the heat of high-stakes moments where reputations are forged or shattered. Now, as the sport braces for the next season, the narrative is loaded with intrigue. Can Hamilton and Mercedes reignite the magic that once made them an unstoppable force? Will Ferrari recover from losing a driver of his stature, or will his departure expose deeper structural weaknesses within the team? How will the dynamics with his new teammate evolve in a paddock already buzzing with rivalry? The answers will unfold under the world's most relentless spotlight, but one thing is certain: the stage has been set for a season that could be remembered not just for its racing, but for the seismic decisions that shaped it. The SF25 had become a relentless puzzle Hamilton couldn't quite solve, a car that seemed to test his patience and adaptability in ways he had not experienced in years. It wasn't simply that the balance was off compared to what he knew, it was that every fiber of the machine's character demanded he abandon the instincts he had built across 8 seasons at Mercedes, where the car's feedback was predictable, its responses linear, its behavior in high-pressure moments utterly trustworthy. The Ferrari was the opposite, demanding, capricious, unforgiving. Its rhythm was alien. Breaking points arrived earlier than his senses told him they should, forcing him to override muscle memory he'd trusted for over a decade. Steering input needed to be impossibly delicate, each corner a study in restraint rather than attack. Throttle application was a razor's edge between traction and chaos, demanding a surgeon's steadiness when instinct begged for aggression. The aero was an ever-present opponent, its behavior inconsistent and laced with traps. At times, the car would feel planted, inviting him to lean into its grip, only for that stability to vanish a corner later, the rear stepping out as if to remind him who was in control. The more he pushed, the more the SF25 seemed to resist, biting back in ways that chipped away at his willingness to fully commit. Even when he found pockets of speed, the confidence to carry that pace through an entire lap eluded him. Energy deployment added another layer of irritation. The way the Ferrari harvested and released hybrid power bore no resemblance to the Mercedes systems he could read like a book. Here the delivery was inconsistent, a surge in one moment, a lull in another, and the unpredictability seeped into his braking, his corner exits, his ability to mount attacks or defend position. Monaco had been the latest blow. The narrow streets and unforgiving walls magnified every quirk of the car, every flicker of instability. The weekend had been a grind from the first practice session, braking zones compressed by the car's awkward energy release, front grip disappearing mid-corner, the rear braking loose at the worst moments. By the time the checkered flag fell, he had little more than a handful of hard-earned points and a weight in his chest that no podium could lift. That evening, long after most of the team had left, Hamilton found himself in the quiet of Ferrari's hospitality area. The clink of cutlery being packed away and the faint hum of refrigeration units formed a backdrop to the low lamplight of the room. Charles Leclerc sat opposite him, posture relaxed but eyes alert, sipping slowly from a mug as though the day's intensity had barely touched him. Hamilton leaned forward, forearms resting on the table, his voice carrying none of the media-polished smoothness he used in front of cameras. "Charles," he began, his tone stripped of ego, "how do you make this thing work for you? Every lap, I'm fighting it. The front won't stick when I need it to, then the rear goes without warning. It's nothing like the Merc. I can't get the timing right, and the aero feels like it's changing on me constantly." Leclerc studied him for a moment, a flicker of a smile touching his lips, not out of arrogance but recognition. "Lewis," he said, calm and measured, "I've grown up with cars like this. You've spent over 8 years in one team, one philosophy, one DNA. That Mercedes became an extension of you. This Ferrari, it's its own creature. The way the downforce builds, the way the tires come into their window, the way it responds to the smallest steering inputs, it's different. You have to let go of expecting it to behave like what you've known." Hamilton exhaled, leaning back slightly, the weight of his frustration visible. "Time is what I feel like I don't have here. Every week it's the same headlines, the same comparisons, people asking if I've lost it. I'm not you, Charles, and I can't drive like you in this thing." Leclerc's voice softened, though his eyes remained steady. "And you shouldn't try to. You've got your own strengths, your own rhythm. But even champions need to adapt. You've been playing the same music for years. Now you're being handed a new instrument. It's like trying to write with your other hand. Awkward at first. Frustrating. But it can be done. The question is whether you're willing to sit with the discomfort until it becomes natural." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the muted sounds of the Monaco night carried faintly through the open doorway, distant laughter from harbor parties, the low growl of an engine being loaded into a transporter, the shuffle of mechanics heading back to hotels. Inside, the tension lingered between them like a charged wire. Hamilton's fingers tapped once on the table, a small, restless motion, before he nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was a flicker of acceptance that the fight ahead wasn't just with the car, but with himself. Despite Leclerc's measured words and the facade of support in the Ferrari garage, Hamilton's mind was already drifting toward an escape route. The tension inside the team had been building for months, growing sharper with every disappointing Sunday, every sideways glance from senior engineers, every pointed question from the media. The constant comparisons to Leclerc were no longer just background noise. They were embedded into every conversation, every debrief, every whisper in the paddock. Ferrari's politics had a way of seeping into everything. The brief silences before meetings began, the subtle digs masked as constructive feedback, the hierarchy that dictated whose voice truly mattered. For Hamilton, the romance of wearing the scarlet suit was eroding under the weight of expectation and the cold, transactional nature of his surroundings. The Hungarian Grand Prix was the tipping point. Another race spent wrestling with a car that refused to yield, another Sunday evening watching Leclerc celebrated while his own performance was dissected with surgical precision. The debrief that followed was brutal, not in words alone, but in tone. There were smiles without warmth, nods that felt rehearsed, and comments that carried the unmistakable scent of an ultimatum. Someone close to the team described it as less about the race and more about sending a message, a reminder that in Ferrari, the clock ticks faster for those who don't deliver. That night, long after the hospitality unit lights had gone out and the paddock had emptied into quiet darkness, Hamilton found himself pacing in his hotel room. The thoughts that had been simmering for weeks now boiled over. He reached for his phone, scrolling to a number he knew by heart. The call connected after barely a ring. "Lewis." Toto Wolff's voice was familiar, grounding, almost disarmingly warm after the clinical precision of Ferrari's environment. There was no small talk. Hamilton's words tumbled out, heavy with exhaustion. "Toto, I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice low but edged with a mix of frustration and relief at finally saying it out loud. "It's not just the car. It's the way they talk to me, the way they watch me like I'm already halfway out the door. I walk into the garage and I feel like an outsider. I need to be somewhere I can breathe again. Somewhere I'm not walking into every weekend already defending myself." Wolff's reply came without hesitation, his tone as decisive as it was reassuring. "Lewis, you know there will always be a place for you here. But if we do this, it's all in. No halfway commitment, no second guessing. We build around you again, from the ground up, just like before. But you have to be ready to put everything into it." His words carried not just an offer, but a challenge, one that reminded Hamilton of the early days when they had forged something unstoppable. What followed wasn't just a conversation, it was a reconnection. They spoke for hours, their voices moving between strategy and nostalgia, laughter and long silences. They revisited the championship years, recalling the races where they turned near-certain losses into victories, the moments where trust had carried them through chaos. Wolff didn't just offer a seat, he painted a vision. Mercedes was already deep into the architecture of its 2026 machine, a car designed under the sweeping new regulations that promised to reset the competitive order. He described the months of wind tunnel work, the new aerodynamic philosophy, the power unit upgrades and development, and how Hamilton's feedback could shape the project from its very first shakedown laps. For Hamilton, the words landed with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. The thought of returning to an environment where his voice wasn't just heard but sought out, where engineers would hang on every detail of his feedback, where every lap in testing would feel like building towards something personal, it was intoxicating. As the hours passed, the conversation shifted from if to when. They spoke of personnel changes, potential sponsors eager to back a Hamilton-Mercedes reunion, and how they could announce it without derailing his remaining time at Ferrari. By the time the call ended, the sky outside Hamilton's window was beginning to lighten, streaks of early morning cutting through the curtains. He sat there for a long time, phone still in his hand, staring into the dim light with a strange blend of calm and adrenaline coursing through him. For the first time in months, he wasn't just reacting to the season, he was imagining a future beyond it. A future where the pressure was still there, but the air was breathable, the politics less suffocating, and the garage a place where he belonged. And in that moment, long before any press release, before the paddock whispers and inevitable headlines, Lewis Hamilton had already started to leave Ferrari behind. Behind closed doors, the pace of the talks was almost breathtaking, yet every step was wrapped in layers of secrecy so dense that even those within the paddock who prided themselves on knowing everything were left guessing. Only a razor-thin circle of people had the full picture, a select few at Mercedes' upper management, Hamilton's most trusted advisors, and his legal team, who were operating with the precision of intelligence operatives. They communicated through encrypted channels, held meetings in discreet locations away from the paddock, and even avoided bringing written documents to ensure there were no leaks. Every detail was guarded like state secrets, because they all knew that one premature word could trigger a political and media storm powerful enough to jeopardize the entire plan. Meanwhile, in Maranello, panic had set in. Ferrari's leadership, though blindsided by how rapidly things were moving, launched an aggressive effort to derail the transfer. They instructed their lawyers to comb through every clause of his contract, looking for technicalities that could force him to stay. Meetings ran deep into the night, as executives debated offering performance-related bonuses, extending his deal with more favorable terms, or even reshaping the technical team around him in a desperate attempt to keep the partnership alive. But the truth, though unspoken in those rooms, was unavoidable. The trust between Hamilton and Ferrari had been shattered. The connection that once carried the promise of glory was gone, replaced by a cold awareness that their visions no longer aligned. No matter what was offered, Hamilton's decision had solidified. For him, this wasn't just about leaving. It was about returning to a place that had been more than a team. It had been a proving ground, a home, the stage where he had written some of the most dominant chapters in the history of Formula One. The pull of Mercedes wasn't merely emotional, it was strategic. He knew the people, the systems, the culture. He understood that beneath the struggles of recent seasons, the DNA of a championship-winning team was still there, waiting to be awakened. And the prospect of being the one to revive it was irresistible. When the paperwork was finally signed, the choreography of the announcement became its own mission. Mercedes' marketing and PR teams had been quietly preparing multiple scenarios, each designed to control the narrative and ignite maximum global attention. They chose one that blended nostalgia with anticipation, a cinematic masterpiece crafted to hit every emotional chord. The video opened with a black screen and a faint sound of an engine revving, slowly growing louder until it was unmistakably the pitch of a Mercedes power unit. Then, in a cascade of slow-motion highlights, Hamilton's greatest moments in silver filled the screen. The champagne sprays, the wheel-to-wheel battles, the victory laps with the Union Jack waving above him. Between these flashes of history, cryptic glimpses of the current W15 silhouette appeared, never fully revealed, but enough to stir speculation. The final sequence was shot with almost theatrical precision, Hamilton, helmet in hand, walking down the familiar corridor of the Mercedes garage. The lighting was moody, the air heavy with anticipation. As he reached the car bay, he stopped, placed the helmet under his arm, and looked directly into the camera. The word home appeared in bold silver letters across the screen. Then it cut to black. Within seconds of the video going live, the internet erupted into chaos. Hashtags like hashtag Hamilton returns, hashtag back to Mercedes, and hashtag Silver Arrows rise surged to the top of global trending lists within minutes. Twitter feeds became walls of fan art, speculation threads, and nostalgic clips. YouTube lit up with reaction videos. Some fans were in tears, others shouting in disbelief and joy. On TikTok, creators slowed the video frame by frame, dissecting every detail: the stitching on his race suit, the shade of silver on the car outline, even the body language in his stride. Memes flooded Instagram within the hour. The ripple effect went far beyond fans. Current and former drivers chimed in, some offering warm congratulations, others posting cryptic emojis that only fueled the speculation about what this meant for the upcoming season. Team principals, even those at rival outfits, made offhand comments to the press, careful not to reveal too much but unable to hide their fascination with the move. In F1 hospitality suites that evening, conversations were dominated by the implications. How would Mercedes adapt the car to Hamilton's style again? How much influence would he have in development? And what message this sent to the rest of the grid? Sponsors saw opportunity and moved quickly. Merchandise mock-ups featuring Hamilton's name and number in silver and teal began circulating internally within hours. Online pre-orders for Mercedes team gear spiked so dramatically that their official store servers briefly crashed. Sports networks adjusted their coverage plans for the season, and ticket demand for certain grands prix spiked, particularly at circuits where Mercedes had historically dominated with Hamilton at the wheel. For Hamilton, watching the storm unfold from the quiet of his inner circle, it was both surreal and energizing. He knew the hard work was still ahead, adapting to the new car, integrating with the evolved team structure, and silencing any doubters who believed his best days were behind him. But in that moment, as the world reacted in a frenzy, one thing was certain: the narrative had shifted entirely. What had begun as whispers of an exit had transformed into the biggest comeback story the sport had seen in years, and it was only just beginning. In the paddock, the air buzzed with a charged energy that seemed to hum beneath the concrete walkways and echo between the motorhomes. Every conversation, whether whispered in hospitality suites or shouted over the whine of impact guns in the garages, circled back to the same topic: Hamilton's shock return to Mercedes. The ripple effect touched everyone. Charles Leclerc, visibly disappointed yet choosing grace over resentment, made no public comment but quietly confided to a trusted journalist, off the record, that sometimes you have to follow your heart, even if it's not the easiest choice to make. The words carried a weight that spoke volumes about his understanding of the situation, a subtle acknowledgement that in Formula One, decisions are rarely purely professional, they're deeply personal. Max Verstappen, approached by a wall of microphones and cameras after a Friday practice session, offered no lengthy analysis. Instead, he gave that small knowing smile he's famous for, a look that suggested amusement, respect, and a quiet awareness of the storm that was about to reshape the competitive order, and said, "It's going to be interesting." The statement was short, but in the measured tone of someone who knew exactly how disruptive Hamilton's return could be, it was loaded with implication. Lando Norris, ever the cheeky instigator, bypassed traditional press altogether, firing off a single tweet that instantly went viral: "Guess we'll see more black overalls around the paddock again." Fans dissected it within minutes, some taking it as playful banter, others as a sly nod to a rivalry he was already anticipating. For Hamilton, this was not just a professional pivot, it was a visceral reclaiming of his identity as a racer. Returning to Mercedes wasn't about nostalgia or sentimentality. It was about forging something new while carrying the lessons and scars from a chapter at Ferrari that had tested him more brutally than any title fight. That period had been a cocktail of flashes of brilliance, bitter frustrations, political undercurrents, and moments of doubt. But those experiences had hardened him, sharpened him, stripped away any illusions. He wasn't walking back into the Silver Arrows garage as the same man who had left. He was walking in as a driver who had stared down both triumph and disappointment and emerged with an unshakable belief that his peak was still ahead of him. Mercedes, too, had changed in his absence. The team's factory floor in Brackley had evolved into an even more advanced ecosystem of precision engineering, simulation mastery, and relentless innovation. The moment Hamilton's return became official, the atmosphere inside the Mercedes camp shifted from quiet determination to an almost feverish anticipation. Engineers who had worked with him during the dominant years found themselves grinning like rookies, eager to reconnect with the driver who had helped redefine what excellence looked like. New faces in the technical department, who had only studied his telemetry and radio calls from afar, were suddenly faced with the reality that they would be collaborating with him directly, an opportunity that carried both excitement and pressure. The fans reacted in a way that shook social media to its core. Hashtags exploded, fan art poured in, and countless posts revisited iconic moments from Hamilton's previous Mercedes era: late-breaking overtakes in the wet, strategic masterclasses, and title-clinching weekends. But the tone wasn't just nostalgic, it was hungry. Supporters were not asking for a repeat of the past. They were demanding something bigger, bolder, a new era of silver arrow dominance written in even fiercer ink. Inside the garage, preparations began immediately. Mechanics fine-tuned every detail of the cockpit to his exact preferences: steering wheel ergonomics, seat padding, pedal resistance, mirror angles. Simulator sessions were scheduled months in advance, with specific focus on circuits where Mercedes had struggled recently, ensuring Hamilton's input would influence setup philosophies long before the first race weekend. Strategy meetings began incorporating his unique racecraft scenarios: how he might handle safety car restarts, unexpected weather changes, or tire degradation patterns under the new compound rules. Other teams, watching all this unfold, felt the shift. Team principals convened private meetings with their technical directors, quietly adjusting their 2025 and 2026 plans to factor in the reality of Hamilton's return. They understood that a driver of his caliber, paired once more with a team capable of matching his ambition, would force everyone else to raise their game or risk being left behind. Sponsors began circling as well, with whispers that several high-profile brands were preparing to link themselves to the Mercedes-Hamilton resurgence, seeing it as a marketing narrative too powerful to ignore. Hamilton himself seemed to feed on the building momentum. Public appearances were calm yet charged, his answers to media questions carefully measured but laced with a barely concealed competitive fire. He spoke not of comebacks but of next steps, reframing his return not as a step backward, but as a forward leap into uncharted territory. He was clear that his motivation was not to rewrite the past, but to craft something even more compelling, something that would silence any notion that his dominance belonged to another era. And as the calendar ticked closer to the opening race of the season, the sense of inevitability grew. The Silver Arrow's garage, bathed in the glow of its meticulously placed LED lighting, seemed to vibrate with readiness. Engineers, strategists, mechanics, and pit crew members all carried themselves with the quiet confidence of a team that knew a seismic change was underway. The fans, louder and more relentless than ever, were preparing for a story that wouldn't just be talked about in the paddock. It would dominate every conversation in the sport. Formula One had been handed the perfect storm, a legendary driver returning to a legendary team, both armed with the hunger to prove that their best was yet to come. And deep down everyone, from rivals to fans to the media, knew this was no ordinary narrative. It was the kind of saga that would ignite headlines, fuel rivalries, inspire impossible drives, and leave a mark so deep that even decades from now, people would still be talking about the moment Hamilton walked back into Mercedes and changed everything.